Previously on Fromily.
You killed someone, and you left 2 people to die in that ambulance.
I know!
I feel like something is watching me.
Is that her? She looks scary.
Help me, Elgin. I can save all of you.
I don't see anything.
That's impossible. You barely looked. Just keep looking.
You're not pregnant.
What is up, Prom fans? Jeremy Eisenfire here, and welcome to the channel. Episode 7 is here, entitled These Fragile Lives, and boy do we see just how fragile some of these lives really were, as this episode certainly wasn't the most exciting of the season, but definitely seems to be maneuvering some pretty interesting pieces into place for the final 3 episodes. As we see Boyd's authority begin to be challenged, Detective Elgin walks a dangerous path, while Fatima channels her inner Abby, and Victor yells at a puppet. And while this wasn't my favorite episode of the season so far, it still had some really interesting scenes and seemed to be setting up a particular nasty schism within the town that could potentially be happening, especially when the events at the end of this episode come to light. But looking at some of our main storylines for episode 7, we start with Elgin and his quest to find out more about the kimono creature. At the beginning of the episode, we see that Elgin has made a gift for Fatima, or rather, for the baby that he thought Fatima was going to have, as it looks to be one of those things you hang over a cradle, albeit Fromville's homemade version of one. When, out of nowhere, the Polaroid camera that he had recently found spits out a mysterious picture of the root cellar, sending Elgin on a journey to hopefully learn a little bit more about the kimono creature. And when he eventually arrives at this root cellar, we have a pretty interesting scene that takes place, as we find an apparent hidden room that had been down in the root cellar, or attached to the root cellar, all this time that we didn't know about. A room with an ominously painted red door, which is one thing we have certainly noticed up until this point. The kimono creature and the color red seem to be very closely tied, which many believe could be some kind of sign of the red symbol in the caves, the one that we haven't really learned much more about yet. But inside the hidden room, which appears to be some sort of makeshift living quarters, or even some kind of improvised cell maybe, as we see a small cot, some candles, and even a chair inside, but we also find an ominous body stuffed in the corner. And judging by the rate of decomposition, it seems like this body has been here for quite a while. Which of course begs the question, just who exactly could this body belong to? And while we think about some of the mysterious characters whose fates haven't been revealed yet in Fromville, we start to wonder, could this potentially be a character like a Christopher maybe? At first I thought it could potentially be possible. But then when we take a little bit of a closer look at the body, we see that it has not only a very long beard, but very long hair as well, which Christopher had neither. Now yes, I suppose it is possible if Christopher was held captive in this place that he could have went on to grow a beard and long hair, but I think it's a bit unlikely, especially given the clothes that the body is wearing don't seem to resemble any of the clothes that Christopher has worn in any of his flashback scenes. Or could this potentially be a new character entirely? Especially considering that the kimono creature seems to be very closely tied to this place and to this body, I am beginning to wonder if this body is someone that we just haven't seen yet on the show, and how this location might be tied to something that happened to her personally, as the last bit of dialogue we get in the scene is Elgin turning to the kimono creature who appears behind him, stating, "Is this where it happens?" Now I thought it was very interesting how Elgin says happens and not happened, which has certainly made some of us wonder, was he speaking in the past tense? Or potentially the present or even the future tense. And this, of course, is another prime example of how the writers tend to leave some of these things very ambiguous for the audience at times, especially considering it seems like Elgin and this kimono creature had some kind of conversation that we are not privy to. With Elgin specifically asking the creature, "Is this where it happens?" indicates to us that she described something that happens in this room either in the past, or something that is about to happen in this room in the future. And definitely let us know your thoughts and comments down below. Do you think Elgin was speaking in the past tense or the future tense? And even though happens could potentially indicate past or present, I get the feeling he is most likely speaking about something that did happen in the past, especially considering the surrounding circumstances of the dead body, and the very fact of this room most likely being hidden for a very long time. But overall, I must say I was a little underwhelmed with the Elgin kimono storyline in this episode. I was hoping for just a little bit more, but hopefully we will get more in these final 3 episodes. But up next, we take a look at Fatima, and how the conditions for her are seemingly beginning to worsen. After the revelation of the ultrasound machine revealing that there might not be anything growing inside Fatima, she begins to get even more concerned, as Christy is starting to suggest that this whole thing could have been psychosomatic, a hysterical pregnancy as it was once referred to. And given the heavy psychological element that has been employed on these characters in Season 3, I suppose it is possible. After all, Ellis has noticed a very deep change inside Fatima very early on in Season 2 when the bus first arrived, when he first started to notice the change within her. And then, of course, they also bring up the possibility of this being something similar to Boyd's worms, some kind of Fromville supernatural aspect that the ultrasound simply couldn't read, leaving Ellis to wonder which nightmare does he have to fear, the nightmare that his father went through, or the nightmare that ultimately killed his mother, as Abby herself also had a psychotic break that led to her death. And even Fatima herself is coming to a similar realization, where she feels if this isn't a baby, then it is her that is changing. And if nothing else, the show From does a very good job at keeping us as the audience guessing as to what is psychological and what is real. And with Fatima, I suppose it could be psychological, but then on the other hand, some of the symptoms she has been displaying seem to be a little too outlandish to just be in her head, most notably her chomping down on human flesh, which it seems like she has not revealed that secret to anyone, not even Ellis yet. But whatever's happening, it's going to be very interesting to see which way this all turns out. Is there something really growing inside Fatima that they simply couldn't see? Is it all simply psychological? Or is it Fatima herself that is undergoing some kind of change? And if so, just what exactly is she changing into? We have talked about the possible balance that might exist with inside Fromville, where usually every time we lose a human member of the town, a new human arrives in Fromville to take its place. But we are wondering, does the same balance exist on the monster side? And if so, did Boyd taking out Smiley create some kind of imbalance that the town needs to correct? We also get a really interesting scene between Donna and Boyd walking from Colony House as well. And one thing I must say, the fog effect inside of Fromville just fits the town and the aesthetic absolutely perfectly. I really hope we see some more fog in some future episodes. But here we see Boyd and Donna discussing what to potentially do about Fatima and what could potentially be happening to her, as it seems like Christy, Mari, nobody seems to know what is really going on with her and has any idea how to even help her. And it certainly seems like this scene could potentially be setting up some sort of rift between Boyd and Donna in the future, especially when the events of the end of the episode come to light. Donna makes a specific point that she wants to do everything she possibly can to help Fatima and Elgin, but on the other hand, she has the entirety of Colony House's safety to look out for, and is worried that Fatima could potentially turn into another Abby, which leads Donna to want Fatima to not stay at Colony House until they figure out what's really going on. And speaking of breakdowns, I can't help but wonder if history might end up repeating itself again, whereas this time, could Ellis potentially be forced to put himself in Boyd's shoes, where he is faced with the choice to put Fatima down to save Boyd or somebody else. And if this episode's ending is any indication, it certainly seems like Fatima is becoming a very real danger to not just herself, but to everybody around her. And speaking of rifts, we also seem to have another one developing between Boyd and the new Officer Acosta, as she barges into the sheriff's station demanding that Boyd give back the gun that he confiscated from her, which of course Boyd is in no hurry to do until she learns that she can be trusted. But in a compromise, he empties all the bullets out of the magazine and hands her the empty gun, with a very stern warning that if she ever returns here without his permission, she's going to have a problem. So it's going to be interesting to see where this little collision course that these two characters are on is going to go. And while we don't get a whole lot from Tabitha or Jade's storylines in this episode, we do see them travel to the ruined settlement so Tabitha can see these stones in person herself. The very same stones that we learned in the previous episode that Tabitha had a reoccurring dream of over and over again as a child. But unfortunately, upon reaching the stones, we get really no revelations to speak of, other than Jade offering up a possibility about how Aristotle potentially got it wrong in terms of free will, and that maybe Tabitha was just always destined to end up here no matter what happened to her, ever since she first started dreaming about this place, very similar to how Miranda was destined to show up here when she started dreaming about this place. And part of me thinks he is potentially onto something. We have wondered for a very long time if Fromville was pulling random people in here for no reason, or if it was bringing specific people here to fulfill specific purposes. And I definitely get the feeling that it is not random. But overall, it was a little bit underwhelming. I was hoping to get a little bit more from Jade and Tabitha's storylines in episode 7. But one thing we did get was another ominous mention of the mysterious knocking outside of the ruined settlement at night. And since they will most likely all be spending the night there yet again, as Julie is staying at the medical clinic because she said her parents won't be home tonight, I'm hoping this time we get something a little more definitive at the ruined settlement. And speaking of Julie, we get an interesting scene between her and Randall as well, as Randall is once again showing that he does have the propensity to be a pretty good guy, as he offers to teach Julie how to drive. But unfortunately, the cicadas show up yet again while Randall is driving, leaving him in a bit of a panic. And speaking of the cicadas, we see a very interesting pattern start to develop between Julie, Randall, and Mari in this episode, as Mari is now revealing that she sometimes feels like the cicadas are still crawling all over her, which now gives us the perfect representation of sight, sound, and touch. Randall is seeing the cicadas, Mari is feeling them, and Julie is still hearing the screaming. Which I get the feeling is certainly not a coincidence. Nor is the fact that when Julie follows Randall into the woods, they stumble upon, of all places, the ruins where they were first held captive. Only they don't really recognize what they are looking at, as they are just seeing it in its ruined form, and not the inside of the actual dungeon. But one thing's for sure, they can both certainly feel something strange the closer they get to it, with Julie wanting to check it out, and Randall wanting nothing to do with it at all, as he looks a little bit afraid and even asks Julie, "Please, can we leave?" Which I believe is the first time I've ever heard Randall even use the word please. So whatever's happening to the three of them, it is certainly not over. Unfortunately, we don't get a whole lot from Victor or the puppet Jasper in this episode either, as we do get a little scene of Victor very frustrated with the fact that Jasper has not chosen to speak to him yet, with Henry only looking more and more concerned about his son's mental health. But later on, we see that Victor takes the puppet to Sarah's house and asks to use her basement. Earlier in the season, we did hear Victor say that the basements were for secrets, so it looks like Victor is hoping to have a little bit more luck at making Jasper talk in the basement. And it'll be interesting to see what Sarah's role is going to be in all this as the series comes to a close as well. Will she potentially be able to connect with this Jasper entity the way she has connected with other entities in the past, and be able to relay some kind of message through Victor? Or will we actually see this puppet talk? But then the episode ends with a horrifying scene inside the greenhouse. Earlier in the episode, we saw Fatima have an interesting episode where she is seeing her stomach start to cave in more and more, yet when Ellis enters the room, it is gone, making us wonder yet again, was it real or just in her head? But seeing her stomach shrivel up like that certainly reminded a lot of us of Smiley's shriveled up insides as well. And upon entering the greenhouse, it looks like Fatima is beginning to have another one of these episodes as she starts screaming in pain, with Fanny Pat Granny, of all people, coming up behind her to try and help, which unfortunately leads to Fatima losing it and stabbing Fanny Pat Granny with a pair of garden shears. Very similar to how Dale stabbed Ellis in Season 2 when he lost it. But one thing I found very interesting was Fanny Pat Granny's reaction to this. How even in the aftermath of her getting fatally stabbed, the last thing she says to Fatima is run. Even in death, Fanny Pat Granny still wants to protect Fatima, which I suppose could potentially be tied to the line we got from Fanny Pat Granny earlier in the episode when Ellis asks her if she is afraid of dying, with Fanny Pat Granny believing that death will not be the end, which could potentially be some kind of foreshadowing of seeing Fanny Pat Granny again later on. If Fatima by chance does go on to survive all of this, I wouldn't be surprised if she starts seeing Fanny Pat Granny, similar to how Boyd sees Cautry, and Jade sees Tom. But with the death of Tilly, it certainly seems to be setting up a very big problem for Episode 8, as it looks like the hunt is going to be on to find out who exactly killed her, and I think this is going to cause a very big rift between Boyd and Donna, and potentially even Acosta as well, as I imagine her, as the newly minted cop in town, is going to want to try and prove herself by solving this murder. Especially with her being deeply disliked in town, maybe she sees this as a chance to earn some brownie points. But whatever the case, I get the feeling that this murder is not going to be able to be kept under wraps for very long. And if this photo of Boyd and Fatima just outside of the little shack that Boyd and Sarah used at the end of Season 1 is any indication, he might just have to get her out of town to keep her safe. But there we have it, From fans. Episode 7, entitled These Fragile Lives, is in the books, and now we look ahead to the final 3 episodes in Season 3. And I'm really hoping that they're saving a lot of the best stuff for these final 3, as I must admit, Episode 7 was a little bit underwhelming compared to what I was expecting. But if nothing else, it was a pretty effective setup episode, as it maneuvered some pretty interesting pieces into place for the final 3 episodes. But that is going to do it for us today, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to leave a like on your way out, and consider subscribing to stay up to date on all of our upcoming content. And until next time, keep those tinfoil hats on, folks, and I will see you on the next one.
A girl is dead because you panicked.
Yeah, I panicked because I was being chased in the dark by things that should only exist in a fucking nightmare.
Well, they exist here. So until you prove that you can handle that, there's not a chance in hell you get anywhere close to a loaded gun. The next time you come in here without my permission, you and me are gonna have a problem.
Whatever you say, Sheriff.
Okay, ding-dongs. If you don't subscribe to Jeremy Ice and Fire, you're gonna spend the night in the box.